Hello heroes, I am AK, and today I am going to show you how to use this tool that I built called getEndThings, which lets you randomly pull out a list of samples from your library and include them in your DAW, and we're going to make this mini loop from scratch. Alright, here we go. So in order to demonstrate like a more creative approach to using this plugin, I generated a little loop very simply. We just have drums, chords, and a melody, and it's very basic. I haven't done any sound design. We're going to use my plugin to do sound design. Here's what our loop sounds like. Drums, just a simple chord progression. And I wrote a melody on top which sounds like this. So there's some musicality to this phrase, but it's boring because there's no fancy sound design. So let's make some fancy sound design. Let's actually first add some more interest to our drums by making and adding some textures. Rather than going into my library and going into my kits and looking for some percussion samples and going through all of these different things and seeing if they fit, I'm going to do something a little more interesting using my wonderful plugin here. So let's tell our getEndThings device to get 112 different samples, and I'm going to get we'll start with some percussion samples. So I'll go into my kits folder here and I'll select percussion and hit choose. And then it's going to grab, well, 112 different randomly selected percussion samples from my library. So I'll drop a sampler into Ableton. And in the zone editor, I will drop in all these different samples, 112 different samples. And what I'm going to do, rather than using the selection group here, is I'm going to use this key selector to say distribute ranges equally. And basically what this is going to do is every time I play a different key on a MIDI keyboard or using my QWERTY keyboard, it's going to play a different sample. But I actually want all of these samples to be pitched at C3, so I'm going to change the root of all of them to C3. So I can just drag this guy in here, and now it's just going to play the sample that's at that particular key. In this case, it's playing a C4, so we'll bring it down to C3. But I don't want it to do that. I want it to scroll through these samples sort of at random. And to do that, I'm going to automate this zone shift. And as I move this zone shift, it's going to move the whole keyboard up and down while still playing C3, so it's going to trigger a different sample. Check it out. Pretty cool. Let's jack the volume up a little bit and add some compression because we have many different samples and I want them to sort of be evened out. I'll raise the volume of my compressor. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this zone shifter around using some automation and see if we can't get some neat results. I actually like to use the Max for Live LFO, which can be put into random mode. So in random mode, it's just going to pick an arbitrary point, and if I map this to the zone shifter, it's just going to move this thing around. So it's playing all of these different samples. I might up the release time on the sample and the curve. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to freeze this right away. We're jumbling through all these different samples. And then when I listen back to my drums, we're going to find a whole bunch of happy accidents that are going to create some nice and interesting syncopation with the beat that we already have. And that's pretty much the idea, at least for percussion samples. I'll show you an example where we'll add melodic interest to the phrase that we wrote using this randomizer. randomizer thing. And if you think this is really useful, you purchase it or you trade me for it, and you want it to like always be available to you, you can drop it right there so we can launch it really quickly. Let's see what we got. So it's like, I love that. I think that fits great. So what I'm gonna do just quickly, and I might speed this up, is I'm gonna just grab all the slices I like and then play back the loop. All right, cool. So here's what we got. I'm just gonna add one more hit here. Cool, not a whole lot of effort. Let's do this one more pass, except this time we're gonna use a different type of, a different folder. We'll use our textures folder. So I want all my C3 notes, and let's actually double time this so the notes are a lot faster, and bring my loop marker in. And yeah, let's mix it up and throw one of these, one up one octave and one of these up one octave here too. So let's get in things. This time let's get 120 things. And let's go into the textures folder. Do I have a textures folder? I thought I did. We'll try ambience. Just grab some ambience. And let's get our sampler going, same way as before. Pull up the zone editor, drag these in. And this time we can actually use the selector to move stuff around. So I'll say distribute ranges equally. And now as I move this selector around, it's going to play back different samples. And in order to do that, I'm going to put this in a group so that I can easily map the selector to a knob. And let's do some quick processing so this is loud enough. In fact, one of the things you can do in a rack like this, if you notice that your samples are all sort of like different volumes, is you can right click and say normalize volumes, and then it's going to sort of go through and gain stage each sample so that it like matches, you know, an average loudness volume. I think it makes it just as loud as possible. And once again, I might put just a saturator, not a saturator, saturator on this with glue compression. And then let's get our random LFO going for that sample selector. You can see as it's moving around, it's triggering these different samples. You can tell it how many samples you want to let play simultaneously. Let's have 3 samples play, up to 3 simultaneously. And let's bring out our release time, so we get some bleed between the samples. And let's just freeze this, just like we did last time. Cool. Let's see what we got. Bring the gain up, turn warping off. Let's mute our instruments for now. Love that already. All right, now we got to do a quick little mixing work to make everything sit better. So with these, I am just going to do some quick EQ and panning. We'll put these a little bit to the left, and we probably don't want all those lows. Probably want to pull a little out of the center and boost the highs. I think that's all it needs. And with this guy, let's also do something similar. Drop in an EQ and a utility, pan it a little bit to the right. So I kind of like the low end there, so I'm going to leave that. I'm just going to cut the low mids. Cool. Here's our drum loop. Cool. So we added quite a bit of interest to our drum loop in just a couple of quick steps. Let's see if we can do the same thing with our melody. So let's listen to now the whole loop with the chords and the melody. Okay, so what we're going to do is very similar to last time. We're definitely going to use a sampler. And this time, instead of fetching like rhythmic and percussive content, we're going to get some melodic content. So I'll head on over to my get end thing script. Let's this time get 104 different samples. And instead of grabbing, percussion samples, I'm going to grab some bass samples. And I can choose any key. Let's choose the key of D sharp. Really doesn't matter what key I choose here, and I'll show you why in a second. So now, when I drag all these samples into my zone editor, I have 104 samples in the key of D sharp, and I'm going to once again distribute the ranges equally, but I'm going to change the root note to D sharp, so that when all these samples play back, Ableton knows that the original key for them is D sharp. So like for example, when I play a C sharp, it's going to play a C sharp. When I play an E, it's going to play a different sample. It's going to play an E. When I play an F sharp, it's going to play an F sharp. So let's just solo these so you can hear that the melody of all of these glitched out samples is going to follow the melody that I actually wrote. That's like a really cool thing. I mean, this doesn't sound great just yet, but it's really cool that we have that level of control, because remember, if I take out the melody, I can start to shift around our little zone editor, and it's going to trigger all these different interesting samples. So let's just listen without futzing with it first. Like for example, when we hit this note a bunch of times, if we start shifting the zone editor, it's going to sound really cool. Did you hear that? It's like it's played just like 10 different samples. So let's use our random LFO just to map it to the zone shifter, and let's speed up the rate here. So now it's going to play back a new sample each time, and I'll just press this key so you can see how it switches around. So cool. So what I might do to just get this prepared for rendering is I might alter the envelope a little bit. So add a little bit more release time and futz with this release curve. I only really want it to play one voice at a time. So I'll say 1 here. We don't need the filter, so we can turn that off. I'll crank up the volume so it sits a little bit more loudly. And here's what we got now. Pretty cool. Let's do 2 passes of that. And let's, of course, I'm just going to do a limiter on the end of this before we render, so we could just like squish it and make sure it sounds right. I do not want it to be louder than 8 semitone, or 8 dB, or I guess 8 dB TP, whatever the heck that is. Mess with the look ahead. And now I'm just going to try to get a level, please. Cool. So let's call this bass chops, and let's render it. I also think it might be interesting for us to mess with the chords, and instead of using sort of like mid basses and things of that nature, it'd be cool if maybe we tried out some synth samples over that line. So in order to sort of get prepared while this is rendering, I'll get end things, and let's get 128. Let's really max it out this time. And let's get 128 samples from my synth presets, and let's get them in the key of A. Again, it really doesn't matter what key, because we're going to adjust the key inside of Ableton, which is dope. Okay, so this guy's done, so he can get flattened out, and we'll go through these bass chops later. So I'll put my 2 passes right next to each other, and we'll turn these off. And let's grab these chords, grab the MIDI for the chords, and drop in an arpeggiator before our sampler, so that when we drop in all of these 128 samples and set the keys to distribute evenly and set the root note to A, whatever note we play is going to work. Let's choose A3. And now, when we play just this guy, it's going to like arpeggiate through these samples, which I want it to do with some added release. Let's hear what this sounds like with our chords. I think I only want 2 samples triggered at once. And remember, when we put in our random LFO here and move around with the zone selector, it's going to create some really interesting results for us. I'm just going to compress these. Alright, let's freeze that because that's sounding really cool already. And so now, with relatively, I'd say, low effort on the synthesis side of things, like we haven't really we haven't programmed any synths or programmed any patches. We've just taken these like thousands of samples that I'm sure you are all collecting and use them in a creative way, sort of mashing them together randomly, so that we can get to this place where we have these like interesting audio printouts that we can then leverage to create harmonic interest in our music. And so I'm, for the next couple minutes, I'm just gonna listen through these and cut out the parts that I like in context with the song, starting with our synth chops. And by the end, we'll have sort of the beginning of, I think, an interesting tune. Let's go for it. Okay, so we went through the synths, and the synths are somewhat interesting. Here's what our synths sound like with none of those bass chops yet. Should be in some of these bass chops and sort of do the same thing. Alright, let's bring in the second bass chops and see if we can layer anything in there. Okay, cool. Check it out. This is the loop that I made from all of these chops, and I'll open them up so you can see sort of how I cut things up. But it was really just a fun process of taking all of these audio samples that we sort of mashed and mangled together with the help, of course, of my Get End Things tool, which is coming to our rescue here. And then just sort of moving the audio around until we found some interesting phrases that we liked. That's the wonderful device I made that is going to help you write glitch music or dubstep or any sort of format where you want to quickly grab a whole bunch of samples, mangle them together, and then have fun working with the results. That's it. Have fun.